In the flickering shadows of a forgotten empire, there was a boy whose mind was not his own, yet held every secret the world tried to bury. They called him a slave. But that title was a lie. His memory, unstoppable, relentless, was a library in itself. Scrolls, manuscripts, forbidden texts he had never read, languages he had never heard, all of it burned in his mind, waiting, screaming to be released. They tried to silence him. They always do. Because knowledge like this is dangerous. Knowledge like this is a threat to those who thrive in darkness, the men who hide behind gold, power, and the illusion of control. He was sold at 10. Not for what he could lift, not for what he could carry, but for what he contained. A human vessel of unclaimed histories, of truths that rulers feared. The moment he spoke, eyes would widen, faces would pale, and then the disbelief would come, followed by ridicule. How could a boy remember libraries that no longer existed? How could he describe books that had been burned centuries before? And yet, the memories were real, vivid, tangible. The way the air trembles before a storm, the way the heart races when it senses a predator just beyond the light. He carried that kind of power in his mind. Every master, every scholar, every priest who tried to unlock his secrets left shattered. They left convinced he was either cursed or divine. And in truth, he was both. His existence was a challenge to the world's most guarded lies. If anyone could verify him, the very foundations of history, the truths carefully constructed to maintain order, would crumble. Yet no one believed him, and the disbelief became a weapon, a tool used to break him. The boy learned quickly. The world does not reward those who remember forbidden truths. The world punishes them. And so he began to hide in plain sight, observing, recording, storing not in scrolls, but in himself. Every word, every symbol, every story of lost knowledge became part of his body, part of his breath. And he began to understand something that would change everything. The real prisons are not chains, not walls, not masters. They are belief, conformity, and fear. Those who control belief, control reality. And the boy was about to rewrite that reality. The boy's memory was not just vast, it was violent in its clarity. He could recall every shelf in the libraries that no longer existed. He could recite texts that had been deliberately erased, passages designed to dismantle the illusions of kings, priests, and the men who claimed the right to define truth. In the quiet corners of the night, when the city slept under the heavy hand of authority, he whispered the names of books that had never been spoken aloud in centuries. And yet, no one heard. Or if they did, they denied it. For denial is the first defense of the powerful. He saw the mechanisms of control everywhere. Every hierarchy, every institution, every ritual. They were designed not to educate, but to condition, to suppress, to keep the masses docile. And the boy, though small and powerless in appearance, understood their architecture intimately. He saw how belief itself was weaponized, how fear could be leveraged to make men worship chains. And in those forbidden texts, he found the instructions, the blueprints for dismantling the machinery. But knowledge without allies is dangerous. Too early, too loud, and the boy would be silenced. They had ways of doing that, ways that leave no evidence, no bodies, no trace, just whispers that someone was mad, or dreaming too loudly. He began to test the limits of his memory, speaking fragments to trusted servants, lowly scribes who had nothing to lose and everything to hide. They listened, wide-eyed, terrified, captivated. He recited formulas for governance that predated empires, rites of initiation older than any living king, laws that were never meant to be known. And with each revelation, he felt a pulse of fear, not for himself, but for those who would come after. Because knowledge, once remembered, cannot be unremembered. It is contagious, a virus that spreads through thought. And those who control it will do everything to contain it, even if it means crushing the innocent. Every memory brought visions, libraries of gold and dust, halls of ink and blood, scholars chained to their ignorance, scribes who had been punished for the crime of seeing too clearly. And in the boy's mind, every punishment, every secret, every act of cruelty was catalogued, stored, and remembered. He realized, with the cold certainty of someone staring into the abyss, that the world is built to forget, to erase what is dangerous, and that he, small, souled, underestimated, was becoming a living archive of forbidden power. The first truth the boy learned was this: history is not written by the victors, it is edited by the terrified. Every empire, every dynasty, every holy institution had its skeletons buried in plain sight, and the boy remembered them all. He saw the councils that decreed which lives were valuable and which were expendable. He read the diaries of those who orchestrated famines, wars, and purges, not for survival, but for control. The world as it had been presented to him, a tapestry of heroes and villains, of justice and virtue, was a lie, a theater constructed to blind and placate. He recalled names no one else dared speak aloud, names of men who whispered across continents, exchanging secrets that dictated the fates of millions, the decisions hidden behind layers of ritual, ceremony, and false morality. They were invisible, yet omnipresent. The boy knew their methods: manipulation of religion, control of food and water, orchestration of fear, the creation of idols to distract and divide. And for the first time, he understood something that would bane in his chest forever, that the chains he saw around others were far more dangerous than the chains around his own body. In the darkest nights, he would lie awake, cataloging the horrors he could not unsee. He remembered the children sold into knowledge slavery, the scholars tortured for telling the truth, the rulers who killed to maintain illusions of grandeur. And he began to see patterns, a network of suppression so vast, so intricately woven, that no one could imagine its breadth without losing their mind. And yet, he could see it. Every node, every connection, every secret meeting and unspoken law. It was all there, mapped in his memory, a mental architecture of hidden dominion. The boy began speaking aloud in whispers, so soft that only the wolves heard him. He spoke of rituals that controlled thought, of punishments that were invisible yet devastating, of techniques designed to strip men of will, leaving only obedience. And as he spoke, he felt something awaken inside him, a fire, a recognition that memory alone is not enough. To survive, to resist, he would have to learn the language of power, of fear, of manipulation itself. Not to serve it, but to master it. And in that realization, he felt the first taste of danger, sharp as steel. Because knowledge this forbidden, once remembered, always demands a choice: to remain silent and survive, or to speak and change everything. And the boy knew, deep in his bones, that silence was a prison he would never accept. The libraries he remembered were unlike anything the world had ever known. They were not merely collections of ink on parchment, they were repositories of human power, designed to store not only knowledge, but influence, ritual, and control. Scrolls spoke of hidden hierarchies, of men and women who shaped reality by whispering in the ears of kings, who manipulated entire populations without leaving a trace. The boy could recall the shape of the shelves, the smell of the dust, the hum of energy that lingered in the air, a resonance left by truths too potent to be allowed to fade. He could see the books that had been burned centuries ago, yet in his memory, they were vivid. Texts on psychological manipulation so precise it could bend wills, manuscripts describing rites that allowed a single individual to command entire cities, treatises on diseases engineered to eliminate dissent, and codes for maintaining obedience across generations. And in the margins, hidden in almost invisible ink, were warnings, warnings the boy could read even as a child, about the price of remembering, the danger of speaking. The warnings were clear: knowledge this powerful destroys those unprepared, consumes those who underestimate it. He began to recite the contents to himself, over and over, in a room no one entered. He catalogued names of forgotten rulers who fell not to swords, but to knowledge leaking from minds like his own. He remembered secret societies that orchestrated history from the shadows, moving pieces of humanity like pawns, laughing at the chaos they engineered. And he saw the systems of belief that reinforced their power: laws, religion, education, all designed to make men obey without questioning, to create the illusion of safety while chaining the spirit. And yet, in the midst of this terror, there was a clarity that few ever achieve. The boy began to see the world as it truly was, a web of unseen forces, of invisible hierarchies, of manipulations layered upon manipulations. The people around him, every master, every servant, every priest, every soldier, they were all players in a game they could not comprehend. And he, small, sold, underestimated, held the key to seeing it all. But with this knowledge came fear. Real fear. Not the fear of chains or pain, but of understanding the cost of memory. Because remembering is dangerous. Speaking is fatal. And the world is full of men who will kill to preserve ignorance. And still, the boy knew. He could never forget. The masters who bought him quickly realized that a mind like his could not be tamed with chains or whips. They tried other methods, methods far subtler, far more insidious. They used fear, isolation, deprivation. They whispered lies, staged visions, twisted reality itself. Forget, they said. Obey. Remember nothing. Speak nothing. But the boy's memory was no ordinary vessel. It absorbed, catalogued, and resisted. Every attempt to break him only carved the knowledge deeper into his mind, refining it, sharpening it like a blade. They forced him to witness horrors designed to crush the spirit, punishments against other slaves, betrayals by those who seemed allies, ritual humiliations that left scars only the psyche could see. But every terror, every act of cruelty, became a lesson in control. He learned to see patterns in the abuse, who wielded fear effectively, who relied on force, who relied on illusion. And with each observation, he catalogued techniques for mental domination, the same techniques that had been used for centuries to maintain order over entire civilizations. They introduced false memories, hoping to overwrite the truths he held. They gave him books that were empty, texts that contradicted the ones he remembered, scholars trained to mislead. They asked him to recite histories that were lies, to prove his obedience, to erase himself. Yet in the silent corners of the night, he recalled the libraries that never burned in his memory, the rituals that never faded, the manuscripts that existed only in his mind. And he began to see an unthinkable truth. The world's most powerful men are not those with armies or gold, but those who can bend belief itself. He discovered the first rule of forbidden knowledge. Fear is the ultimate lever, but only if the mind accepts it. Those who know how to master their fear, who see the illusions for what they are, gain control far beyond any throne or sword. And the boy, young and enslaved, began the slow, dangerous process of mastering his own mind, learning to tame the instruments of control against themselves. Every whispered threat, every lie, every cruel game became a tool for understanding, for power. By the time he was a man, he had catalogued a lifetime of knowledge, memory, and manipulation, an arsenal invisible to the world, impossible to deny to himself. And he understood something that terrified even him. The same systems designed to enslave him could be used to reshape the very foundations of society. But to do so would require audacity, secrecy, and a willingness to confront horrors that no ordinary mind could survive. The boy learned that survival required cunning far beyond physical strength. The masters feared his memory, but they believed they controlled him because they controlled his body. That was their first mistake. Slowly, carefully, he began to speak in riddles, embedding truths in stories, embedding power in whispers. Servants, scribes, even low-ranking scholars began to notice the patterns. At first, they dismissed it as coincidence. But the more he spoke, the more the impossible truths leaked through. The forbidden knowledge embedded in parables, in fragments, in phrases that seemed meaningless to anyone untrained in listening. Every whispered truth was a test. Every partial revelation was a trap to gauge the loyalty, or fear, of those who heard him. He was careful. One misstep, and death was inevitable. The masters would have erased him quietly, leaving no trace. But as he recited forbidden formulas for memory, ritual, and governance, he saw the flickers of understanding in the eyes of his listeners. And with that understanding came something dangerous, hope. Hope in minds that had long been trained to obey, to accept ignorance. He began to understand the psychology of obedience at the deepest level. Fear, he realized, is a tool, and like any tool, it can be wielded in different ways. Those who wield it to dominate are powerful. Those who wield it to awaken are dangerous. And he, small and underestimated, was learning to become both. In silence, he mapped the mechanisms of corruption that ran through families, kingdoms, and empires, noting who obeyed blindly, who questioned quietly, and who had the spark of awareness that could not be extinguished. Then he began to test limits he had never imagined. Small acts, misplaced items, corrected lies, recited passages that contradicted official records, tiny shocks that forced those around him to question. And the masters noticed. Their fear grew. But still, they did not understand the boy. Memory, they assumed, could be broken. Knowledge, they assumed, could could be erased, and that assumption would become their undoing. By the time he reached adolescence, the boy was no longer merely a slave. He was a living archive, a subtle agent of disruption, and a force that could unravel the carefully constructed illusions of the powerful. And in the quiet corners of the night, he whispered to himself a single truth that would guide every step. Control is an illusion, but knowledge, true knowledge, cannot be contained. Alone in the dim corners of the estate, he began to reconstruct what no one else could see. The libraries existed in his mind, vivid and complete, and he mapped them carefully, silently, as if the walls themselves were listening. Each text, each manuscript, each erased ritual became a living diagram, stored in memory and rehearsed until it was inseparable from his very being. He could visualize every ink page, every forgotten symbol, every ritual sequence that men in power had spent centuries trying to erase. The knowledge was dangerous, not because it promised wealth or glory, but because it revealed the truth about power. There were texts on bending thought, on manipulating perception, on creating obedience without force, manuals for controlling entire populations, treaties written in secrecy, instructions for rituals that connected belief, fear, and action. And the boy remembered them all. Every misdeed, every manipulation, every buried truth that should have remained hidden was catalogued in the labyrinth of his mind. He tested these memories in secret, first with simple experiments, predicting decisions, uncovering hidden motives, exposing lies. Each success fed his confidence and sharpened his awareness. He realized that knowledge itself is a weapon, far more potent than chains or swords. And with it comes responsibility, the responsibility to see clearly, to act subtly, to remain invisible while observing the machinery of control at work. Because if those who held power sensed that he understood, they would stop at nothing to destroy him. And yet, he felt a growing hunger. The boy realized he was not content with merely surviving. To truly wield this knowledge, to turn the tables on those who had sought to break him, he needed allies, men and women who could perceive the hidden structures of control, who could see the world as he saw it. But these were rare. Most minds, conditioned for obedience, could not withstand even a glimpse of the machinery that ran society. Many would crumble, many would betray him, and some would vanish without a trace, consumed by fear or misdirected loyalty. So he chose carefully, whispering fragments to those who demonstrated the spark of understanding, testing them with puzzles, questions, and moral dilemmas. Each listener became a gatekeeper, a subtle propagator of forbidden knowledge, and a test of whether the systems of control could be infiltrated. And as he did this, he began to understand an ultimate truth. Knowledge remembered is power, but knowledge shared, even carefully, is dangerous beyond imagination. It was inevitable. Those who thrive in the shadows always sense when knowledge grows too large, too dangerous, too uncontrollable. They sent men, agents, scholars, and enforcers trained not to negotiate, but to erase. They moved quietly, like predators who know the terrain better than their prey. At first, the boy thought he was prepared. He had memorized libraries, mastered psychological resistance, and tested loyalty in whispers. Yet, nothing could fully prepare him for the suffocating presence of those who sought not to debate, but to obliterate. They entered the estate under the guise of visitors, priests, and inspectors, but the boy could see them for what they were, hunters of truth, trained to recognize the spark of memory that could unravel centuries of deception. They questioned him subtly at first, asking mundane things, names of scholars, dates of rituals, minor details that could be innocent. But he knew their true purpose. Every word he spoke would be weighed, every hesitation noted, and one mistake, one slip of recollection, could cost him everything. The boy responded carefully. He spoke in riddles, embedding truths within lies, planting fragments that could mislead without revealing the full scope of his knowledge. And yet, as he observed them, he noticed something terrifying. These agents were not just enforcers, they were students, trained in the same lost arts he had memorized. They had learned to see patterns, to recognize memory as a weapon, to anticipate thought itself. And in that moment, the boy realized the stakes were far higher than survival. This was no longer a test of endurance. It was a contest of intellect, strategy, and understanding of forbidden power. Fear flickered in him, sharp and precise, but he did not let it show. Instead, he calculated, observed, and adapted. Every question became an opportunity. every interaction a map of their knowledge, every hesitation a window into their methods. By the end of the encounter, he had learned more about their systems of control than any book could teach. He understood not only their strengths, but their weaknesses, arrogance, assumption, overconfidence, the belief that they could anticipate a mind that remembered more than they could ever erase. When the agents finally departed, satisfied, or so they thought, the boy felt a surge of something he had never experienced before: empowerment. The first wave of confrontation had passed, and he had survived. But the knowledge of what was coming, of the relentless pursuit that would continue until either he was destroyed or the world was forced to remember, burned in his mind. And he knew, with absolute clarity, that the path ahead would demand cunning, audacity, and the relentless cultivation of forbidden memory, because once you remember the libraries they tried to erase, you can never forget. After the agents left, the boy realized something profound. Survival alone was no longer enough. Knowledge without action is merely burden. Memory without strategy is vulnerability. He began to see himself not as a victim of circumstance, but as a vessel of power. Every memory he carried, every erased text, every forbidden ritual, was now a weapon. But like any weapon, it required precision, patience, and understanding of the terrain. The world had trained men to obey. He would train himself to move beyond obedience entirely. He spent nights in solitude, walking the quiet halls, rehearsing the libraries in his mind, breaking them down into systems, hierarchies, patterns. He began to catalog the institutions, the families, the hidden orders that had enforced control across centuries. Each memory became a node in a network, each ritual a lever, each story of oppression a blueprint for reversal. He saw that fear and belief were the same substance, molded differently depending on who held the hands. And with that realization came clarity. The same tools used to enslave minds could, in the right hands, awaken them. The boy also confronted his own limitations. Memory alone was immense, but memory without discernment is chaos. He learned to filter, to prioritize, to identify which truths could be revealed safely, which were too dangerous even for allies. He experimented with subtle influence, observing the responses of those around him, mapping reactions like a general surveying a battlefield. Every conversation became intelligence gathering, every whispered question a test of loyalty and comprehension. His mind became a battlefield and a command center simultaneously. He began to understand another critical truth. Power is invisible until it is exercised, and exercised incorrectly, it invites annihilation. He had seen what happened to those who wielded knowledge without subtlety. Crushed, erased, made examples of. And he vowed, silently and with meticulous calculation, that he would never be another casualty. Every move would be deliberate, every revelation calibrated. Memory alone had kept him alive until now, but strategy would make him unstoppable. And as he prepared for the next inevitable confrontation, the boy understood something even deeper. The world does not fear strength. The world fears clarity. It fears those who see through the illusions, who remember the truths others have buried, who refuse to obey silently. And that realization, cold and electric, became the first principle of his transformation. He was no longer merely a boy who remembered libraries. He was becoming a man who could bend the world to the logic of memory itself. The boy realized that memory alone was not enough. To survive, and to bend the world, he had to act, subtly, invisibly, like a shadow moving through the machinery of power. His first acts were small, almost imperceptible, but precise. He whispered guidance to servants, nudged scholars toward forgotten truths, rearranged fragments of information to provoke doubt in those who believed themselves untouchable. Every gesture, every word, was measured. Every ripple of change was deliberate. He discovered the first law of manipulation. The world bends to those who understand the desires of others better than they understand themselves. A whisper here, a corrected assumption there, and the seeds of doubt began to grow in the minds of those who had believed themselves untouchable. Scholars questioned their own understanding of history, masters doubted their control, and even the lowliest observers began to perceive inconsistencies in the narrative they had been fed all their lives. And the boy, small, enslaved, underestimated, watched with cold satisfaction. But he also understood the danger. Every act of influence carried risk. If discovered, the consequences would be immediate and lethal. He had witnessed what happens to those who overstep. Knowledge that is wielded too openly becomes a beacon to the powerful, and the powerful, in their fear, strike first and without mercy. And so he became invisible, a ghost threading through the corridors of authority, leaving no trace, but everywhere leaving a subtle signature: doubt, confusion, curiosity. The boy's manipulations grew bolder with each success. He learned to redirect the flow of decisions, to alter outcomes without ever appearing to intervene. A decree here, a minor betrayal there, a secret uncovered at the right moment, and the structures of control began to wobble. He realized something terrifying. The systems built to enslave humanity are delicate. They are illusions held together by fear, ignorance, and obedience. And with careful precision, even a single mind, armed with memory and strategy, can start to unravel them. And in those quiet moments, alone in the shadows, the boy felt a surge of recognition. He understood that this was more than survival. This was initiation. The first step in becoming someone who could wield knowledge, not as a burden, but as an instrument of power. And as he whispered fragments of forbidden memory to those who dared to listen, he began to see a pattern forming. Knowledge spreads, belief shifts, and the world, for the first time, might tremble under the weight of memory itself. The boy had learned to move like a shadow, to whisper without being heard, to influence without being seen. But the world does not tolerate anomalies indefinitely. The first cracks in the system began to ripple back toward him. Masters noticed small discrepancies in reports. Scholars began to question events that were supposed to be unquestionable. A low-ranking scribe was caught murmuring passages that had no official record, questioning doctrines that had been considered eternal. And all of it led, inevitably, to him. The agents who had once interrogated him now returned, sharper, more suspicious, trained to detect the faintest tremor of forbidden memory. Their questions were precise, their presence suffocating, their methods silent but violent in intent. They were no longer just watchers, they were hunters. And the boy understood, in that cold, visceral way that comes only with true danger, that discovery would not be a debate, not a test of intellect, it would be annihilation. His survival depended on anticipation, on predicting every step, on controlling every ripple he had created. He began to treat every interaction as a battlefield. Each smile, each word, each gesture was calculated. He manipulated perception itself, planting illusions to protect the core of his memory while allowing enough false exposure to distract and confuse. He whispered truths in ways that seemed innocuous, shared fragments of forbidden knowledge to shift suspicion elsewhere, and tested the reactions of those around him like a general probing an enemy line. Every move had to be flawless. Every miscalculation could cost him everything. And yet, in the tension, he discovered an unexpected clarity. Danger sharpened the mind, stripped away complacency, and forced him to see not just the systems of control around him, but the very architecture of human belief. He understood that fear itself could be weaponized, that those who thrived on control were vulnerable to the very tools they wielded. And with each calculated maneuver, he felt a subtle transformation, not just as a survivor, but as a strategist, a manipulator, a master of forbidden memory and subtle influence. By the time the agents left that night, unsatisfied but unaware of the full extent of his comprehension, the boy had made a vow. He would not merely survive. He would turn the systems of control against themselves. And he would remember everything, not for power, not for vengeance, but to awaken those who could see, to illuminate the machinery of domination in a world built to forget. Because once memory takes root, it cannot be erased, and he would make sure that the world would never be able to forget what it had buried. The opportunity came unexpectedly. A council of local rulers had gathered. Their meeting intended to enforce obedience and consolidate control. Orders, alliances, and punishments were to be formalized, rules written to ensure compliance for decades. The boy observed from the periphery, unseen, cataloging the participants, memorizing their habits, predicting their moves. Every gesture, every glance, every subtle inflection became data, feeding a map in his mind of influence, fear, and loyalty. He began his work subtly. A misplaced document here, a whispered suggestion there, a carefully timed question to a minor advisor, so small that no one suspected interference, yet enough to seed doubt. The boy understood that power is fragile, that belief can be nudged like a pendulum, that a single thread, when pulled precisely, can unravel an entire tapestry. And as the meeting progressed, the seeds he planted began to sprout. Decisions that seemed inevitable wavered, alliances frayed, the confidence of those in power faltered. He felt a rush of awareness. This was the true measure of his power: memory, strategy, and patience combined. He did not need to wield force. He did not need to threaten, punish, or coerce. Influence is far more potent than brute strength, far more insidious, far more permanent. By remaining invisible, by understanding the psychology of obedience, he could steer men who believed themselves masters of reality, and they never even knew he existed. But the act was not without risk. One misstep, one overlooked reaction, one suspicion, and the consequences would be immediate and brutal. The boy's mind raced, anticipating contingencies, rehearsing escapes, planting diversions, and ensuring that the ripple of influence could not be traced back to him. It was a game of intellect, instinct, and intuition, a deadly ballet performed in silence. When the council adjourned, the outcomes had shifted subtly but irrevocably. A decree intended to suppress a group of dissenters had been softened, a punitive measure postponed, a minor rebellion allowed a chance to survive. Those in power walked away, unaware of the invisible hand that had guided them, while the boy retreated, silent, unseen, cataloging the results in meticulous detail. He understood something that few ever do. True power is invisible until it is exercised, and when exercised correctly, it leaves no trace, yet changes everything. In that moment, the boy no longer saw himself as a slave. He saw himself as a force of history, a keeper of forbidden knowledge, a manipulator of belief, and a guardian of truths no one else could bear to remember. And he understood, with unshakable certainty, that the path ahead would demand audacity, cunning, and absolute mastery of the mind. For once you begin to bend the world with memory, the world will fight back with everything it has. The first real attempt to unmask him came like a shadow in the night. Agents, sharper and more ruthless than ever, descended on the estate, their purpose clear: flush out the boy, expose his knowledge, erase him from existence. They moved with precision, trained in the arts of observation, deception, and psychological pressure. No chain, no whip, no sword was needed. They were hunters of memory, predators who knew that the mind could be more dangerous than any army. He sensed them immediately. Every subtle shift in the air, every quiet movement behind closed doors, every conversation that faltered under scrutiny told him they were near. Fear flickered, sharp and electric, but he did not show it. He had learned that fear, when acknowledged and mastered, becomes clarity, and clarity was his weapon. He began to orchestrate his environment like a general arranging troops for battle. Doors locked subtly, light and shadow manipulated, words and actions crafted to mislead. Every step of the agents was anticipated, every reaction accounted for. The boy tested them, deliberately leaving false clues, planting fragments of memory that led nowhere, watching their behavior with meticulous care. Each question they asked, each probing glance, each whispered demand was logged and analyzed. He began to see patterns in their pursuit: arrogance, assumptions, overconfidence, and an underestimation of minds that remember too much. These were vulnerabilities, gaps in their armor that he could exploit. But the danger was real. One misstep could mean death. One failure to anticipate a question, one overlooked connection, and the agents would strike without hesitation. They did not tolerate failure, and the boy understood that the systems built to hide knowledge were ruthless, unyielding, and omnipresent. And yet, he also realized something terrifyingly exhilarating. For the first time, he could see the full machinery of control laid bare. Every fear, every manipulation, every hidden hierarchy, it was all visible to him now, and he could move through it, unseen, untouchable. By the end of that night, the agents had left, frustrated, confused, and with no trace of their quarry. The boy had survived, not by hiding, but by anticipating, understanding, and mastering the very systems that sought to destroy him. And in the quiet aftermath, he understood a truth that would guide him forever. The world's most dangerous men are not those with swords or armies, but those who remember, who calculate, and who refuse to obey silently. And he, small, enslaved, underestimated, had become one of them. Survival alone no longer satisfied him. He understood something deeper. Memory, when hoarded, is incomplete power. Knowledge gains its true potency when it spreads, when it awakens minds, challenges obedience, and exposes the illusions of control. But spreading forbidden truths carried enormous risk. The wrong person, the unready, could betray him, crumble under fear, or be destroyed themselves. He had to choose carefully. Precision was the difference between awakening and annihilation. He began testing fragments of memory on those who showed sparks of perception. A servant, a scribe, a scholar, small, seemingly insignificant people whose eyes had glimpsed cracks in the system. He whispered paradoxes, posed riddles, shared fragments of erased histories. At first, nothing seemed to change. They dismissed his words, questioned his sanity, or repeated them cautiously to themselves. But some, just a few, paused. Their minds hesitated. Something clicked. A seed of doubt, a spark of awareness, and the machinery of obedience wavered. The boy recognized the first law of awakening. Knowledge must be encoded, filtered, and tailored to the receiver. Too much truth too soon, and the mind collapses under its weight. Too little, and the memory is lost, unheeded. He adjusted his delivery like a surgeon, planting pieces of forbidden knowledge that revealed just enough to unsettle, to create curiosity, to awaken vigilance without triggering alarm. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to see the first stirrings of independent thought. But every act of awakening sent ripples. The agents, sensing subtle disruptions in obedience and loyalty, began their search anew. Their vigilance increased. The boy realized that awakening others was a game of shadows and mirrors. Every fragment shared had to be tested, every reaction observed, every potential exposure accounted for. And yet, in this dangerous balance, he discovered exhilaration. For the first time, memory was no longer merely survival. It was a tool for influence, a weapon for liberation, a way to bend the very structures of fear and belief without being seen. And in the silence of his chambers, he rehearsed the first unspoken rule of forbidden power. The awakening mind is unstoppable once it begins, but it must be nurtured in secrecy. Each spark he planted was a light in the darkness, a crack in the walls of control. And he knew, deep in his marrow, that the world could never allow such sparks to exist, and that was exactly why he would ensure they spread. No system is perfect. No mind, no matter how sharp, can anticipate every turn of human weakness. The boy learned this the hard way. One of those he had whispered forbidden fragments to, a scholar with a spark of understanding, betrayed him. Not out of malice, but fear. Fear twisted truth. Fear created illusions, and fear whispered lies louder than any memory could resist. The scholar approached the masters, speaking carefully, half-truths wrapped in speculation, enough to draw suspicion without exposing the full depth of knowledge the boy carried. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. The boy realized that memory, no matter how perfect, cannot shield against trust misjudged. He had catalogued libraries, rituals, strategies, and histories, but human treachery had no precedent to be remembered. It was unpredictable, uncontainable, lethal, and in that instant, he understood a terrifying law. Knowledge awakens power, but power awakens fear, and fear awakens betrayal. Every ally is a potential threat, every whisper a risk, and every secret a weapon for both survival and destruction. He retreated into the recesses of his mind, reconstructing strategies, rehearsing contingencies, and analyzing every detail of the betrayal. He catalogued the motives, the triggers, the weaknesses that had allowed the betrayal to occur. Every lesson, painful and raw, was recorded meticulously. And in that reconstruction, he began to evolve, not just as a vessel of memory, but as a master of human perception, of anticipation, of manipulation. Memory alone was no longer enough. He needed mastery over intent, over psychology, over the subtle architecture of influence. The boy realized another truth, darker and more profound. The systems of control he had begun to unravel relied not only on ignorance but on the fear of truth itself. Fear turns allies into enemies, obedience into betrayal, and even memory into danger. And the more he understood this, the more precise his actions became. Every word, every whisper, every gesture had to be calculated not only to manipulate outcomes but to anticipate treachery, to guard against the unpredictable nature of human weakness. By the time the night fell, the boy had emerged transformed. The betrayal had taught him something no book, no library, no ritual could ever convey. Knowledge alone cannot protect you. Only strategy, vigilance, and the understanding of human desire, fear, and fragility can. And from that night forward, he vowed never to underestimate the treachery that lurks within even those who seem most awakened, and to use it, when necessary, as a weapon of his own making. The betrayal had left scars, but it had also illuminated a path. The boy understood now that forbidden memory alone was not enough. It required infrastructure, strategy, and subtle orchestration. He began to refine his network, choosing allies with extreme care, observing every inclination, every hesitation, every flicker of curiosity or doubt. Each person became a test of perception, a gauge of resilience, a potential propagator of knowledge if handled correctly. He learned to encode his memory in layers, revealing only fragments at first, gauging reaction, then allowing deeper truths to unfold as understanding and loyalty grew. It was a slow, deliberate process, like threading a needle in darkness, each stitch strengthening the fabric of influence while minimizing exposure. Every whisper, every suggestion, was measured to provoke thought without triggering fear strong enough to incite betrayal. And he began to notice something remarkable. Fear itself could be weaponized, not to dominate, but to awaken. He used fear to sharpen perception. By creating small, controlled tensions, he forced those around him to question assumptions, to observe carefully, to think critically. A misplaced document here, a subtle contradiction there, a whispered doubt at the right moment. Fear became the lens through which others glimpsed truth without realizing it. Those who could withstand it became his instruments, and those who could not simply revealed the fragility of obedience, teaching him where influence could be safely extended. At the same time, the boy continued to catalog every hierarchy, every ritual, every manipulation embedded in the systems of control, every action of the masters, every subtle test of loyalty, every hidden order he could perceive was filed in his mind like a living archive. And through this process, he began to see the architecture of fear itself, not as a trap, but as a tool. Fear could be redirected, amplified, or minimized. It could be a signal, a motivator, a weapon, or a shield. By the time he emerged from the shadows to interact with his network, he had transformed into more than a vessel of forbidden memory. He had become an architect of influence, a manipulator of perception, and a master of fear itself. Knowledge was no longer dormant within him. It was alive, flowing, adaptable, and strategic. And he understood, with the precision of a general surveying a battlefield, that this was only the beginning. Every mind awakened, every ripple of doubt spread, every carefully orchestrated fear moved him closer to unmasking the systems of control entirely. The boy paused one night in the quiet of his chambers, alone with the weight of all he remembered. The libraries that no one else could see, the rituals erased from history, the manipulations that had shaped empires, they were all inside him, unyielding and alive. And in that stillness, he understood a truth that had been unfolding in fragments for years. Memory alone is power, but strategy is dominion. Knowledge without action is silence. Action without awareness is destruction. He had to become both, simultaneously, a living archive and a master of the game that governed the world. In that moment, he acknowledged the duality that had defined him since childhood. He was the vessel of the past, carrying every secret buried by fire, fear, and decree. He was also the architect of the future, a silent hand nudging events, testing loyalty, exposing illusions, and awakening minds without being seen. Every betrayal, every test, every act of subtle influence had honed him for this purpose. He realized that he could no longer exist as a mere survivor. He had to embrace the responsibility of memory made active, of knowledge transformed into force. He spoke aloud a phrase he had whispered to no one before. I remember, and I move. The words were simple, yet heavy with intent. They were a declaration to himself, to the world, and to the unseen forces that had tried to erase him. Memory without motion is stagnation. Motion without purpose is chaos. But when combined, they create inevitability. He understood now that his role was not just to survive, to influence, or to awaken. It was to ensure that forgotten truths could not be buried again, that the systems of manipulation, fear, and obedience would face an invisible adversary with perfect recall and unerring strategy. And in that realization, the boy felt a surge of something almost forbidden, exhilaration. He was no longer hunted. He was a force, quiet but unstoppable, subtle but precise. The fear that had once threatened to paralyze him had become fuel, sharpening his intellect, clarifying his perception, and fortifying his resolve. And with it came a commitment to awaken, to influence, to challenge, and to survive with cunning and clarity. From that night forward, every act, every whisper, every shadowed movement would be deliberate, each decision a stroke of strategy informed by memory too vast to erase. The boy was no longer simply remembering, he was orchestrating, and the world, unknowingly, was about to feel the first tremors of a force that no chain, no lie, no agent could contain. The boy understood that true power required more than solitary mastery. It demanded the awakening of others who could perceive what the world sought to erase. He began to move with precision, selecting those whose minds could withstand fragments of forbidden knowledge without breaking. Servants, scribes, low-ranking scholars, each was tested, observed, and nurtured until they proved capable of seeing beyond obedience, beyond faith. Slowly, imperceptibly, he began to plant seeds of awareness. He whispered truths in layers, fragments that seemed innocuous on the surface but carried deep resonance for those who listened carefully. One word here, a corrected record there, a subtle contradiction buried in a story. They were all levers, nudges to awaken curiosity and challenge assumption. And as the first sparks of comprehension ignited, he noted every reaction, every hesitation, every sign of fear and resistance. Knowledge, he realized, was contagious, but only if carefully administered. The ripple effect began almost immediately. Questions arose where obedience had been unquestioned. Subtle doubts infiltrated the minds of those in authority. Decisions that seemed predetermined wavered under the invisible influence of minds that had begun to awaken. And the boy, hidden in plain sight, monitored it all with the precision of a conductor orchestrating a symphony. Every whisper, every glance, every fragment shared was deliberate, calibrated to awaken insight without triggering suspicion. But danger was never far. The agents of the masters moved quietly, sensing disruption in the normal order, probing for the source of anomalies. The boy anticipated each approach, planting diversions, encoding knowledge in layers of misdirection, and testing the limits of fear itself. Each act of awakening carried a risk. A single mistake could expose him or his allies, undoing months of careful preparation. And yet, he persisted, knowing that influence grows strongest when invisible, subtle, and resilient. By the time the first network of awakened minds began to communicate in whispers and coded gestures, the boy understood the magnitude of what he had created. He was no longer alone. Memory had become motion, knowledge had become strategy, and subtle fear had become a tool to guide those ready to see. And in that quiet orchestration, he realized an undeniable truth. A single awakened mind can survive, but a network of awakened minds can reshape the very architecture of obedience itself. The first confrontation was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. Agents arrived in quiet waves, probing the edges of the boy's network, testing the responses of those he had awakened. They asked questions, observed behavior, and planted subtle traps designed to expose the flow of forbidden knowledge. Every move was calculated, every whisper monitored, every reaction catalogued. And yet, the boy remained invisible, orchestrating every action from the shadows, a conductor whose instruments were human minds. He had prepared for this moment. Layers of misinformation, coded signals, and carefully timed actions allowed his network to appear compliant while continuing to awaken understanding beneath the surface. A scribe hesitated at a question, feigned ignorance at a decree, or offered a misdirection that led the agents into false assumptions. Every member of the network had learned to move like shadows, to think in patterns, to anticipate the subtle pressures of fear and expectation. And all the while, the boy observed, calculated, and adjusted. The agents, confident in their training, began to grow frustrated. Their methods relied on obedience, on predictable responses, on fear that could be measured. But the boy's network had been taught to convert fear into clarity, to observe, anticipate, and act without revealing the full extent of their knowledge. And that uncertainty unnerved even the most disciplined enforcers. Doubt crept into their ranks, suspicion poisoned their judgments, and hesitation spread like a virus through their ranks. The boy realized, with cold satisfaction, that this was the power of memory combined with strategy. Knowledge alone had kept him alive. The orchestration of perception, the subtle manipulation of fear, had now allowed him to control outcomes without revealing himself. And in that moment, he understood a critical truth. Systems built on obedience are fragile. They collapse under the weight of doubt, and a network of minds that can think, anticipate, and act collectively becomes unstoppable. By the end of the confrontation, The agents withdrew, frustrated and disoriented, unable to trace the source of the disruption. And the boy's network, strengthened and emboldened, had survived intact. He observed each member, noting their growth, their confidence, and their loyalty, not to him, but to the truth they had begun to see. And in that quiet, electric moment, he understood a deeper law of forbidden knowledge. Awakening minds cannot be contained. Fear can be redirected, and those who think they control the world are most vulnerable to the invisible forces they cannot perceive. The boy paused in the quiet of the night, surrounded by the subtle hum of awakened minds. He realized that knowledge alone does not transform a man. Only commitment does. Memory without intent is a whisper lost to time. Action without resolve is a shadow that fades. And he understood that to solidify his power, to cement the awakening, a declaration was required, not of words to others, but of recognition to oneself. He turned inward, speaking a phrase that carried all the weight of his journey, all the lessons learned through fear, betrayal, and revelation. I remember, and I act. He whispered it twice, deliberately, allowing it to echo in the hidden chambers of his mind. The words were more than a mantra. They were a covenant, a binding promise to never forget, never obey blindly, and never allow knowledge to be buried again. Memory had become motion, thought had become strategy, and intent had become unstoppable. And then, he looked outward, understanding that the same principle could awaken others. He spoke directly to those willing to listen, to those who were ready to claim knowledge as their own. Repeat this phrase, twice, to anchor it in your being. I remember, and I act. Twice, exactly, he instructed. For those who did, something shifted. A spark in the mind, a crack in the walls of fear, a recognition of power hidden in plain sight. It was symbolic, yes, but also practical. Repetition aligns thought with action, embedding intention deep into the psyche, making the transformation irreversible. The boy watched as the phrase echoed in the minds of his network, weaving subtle yet profound changes. Eyes that had once followed commands without question now observed, calculated, and anticipated. Minds that had been obedient now questioned, considered, and moved independently. The world was unchanged on the surface, but underneath, the first tremors of disruption spread silently, dangerously, and powerfully. He understood something crucial. Commitment is the bridge between knowledge and transformation. Without it, memory is innate. Without it, strategy is impotent. But with it, the awakened become unstoppable, invisible yet influential, like shadows bending the world without detection. And as he whispered the words again, for himself and for those ready to embrace the transformation, he knew this was the turning point, the moment when knowledge became power, and power became purpose. The first tremors of change spread silently but relentlessly. Decisions once unquestioned began to wobble. Orders issued by the powerful were delayed, rewritten, or quietly undermined by subtle influences that no one could trace. Scholars whispered to one another. Servants hesitated before delivering reports, and even the enforcers who had once prowled the estates with confidence found themselves caught in a web they could not perceive. The boy's memory, strategy, and network were now operating as a single, invisible force, unseen, unstoppable, and precise. He observed every ripple. A minor rebellion that should have been crushed persisted, not through force, but because the perception of obedience had been altered. Decisions meant to suppress dissent faltered because someone in the hierarchy hesitated, questioned, or misinterpreted a subtle nudge planted weeks before. Systems built on fear were fragile. They collapsed not with violence, but under the weight of doubt, curiosity, and the invisible hand of strategic memory. The boy catalogued each failure of control meticulously, learning faster than the masters could react, adapting the network in real time. Yet he remained cautious. The agents had not disappeared. They were still hunting, still observing, still attempting to unravel the threads he had woven. Every act of awakening had to be precise, every fragment of knowledge carefully calibrated to avoid exposure. The boy's network acted like a living organism, each member a neuron transmitting subtle influence, each connection reinforcing the strength and resilience of the whole. And in that structure, he discovered a terrifying truth. Once knowledge spreads through the right minds, it cannot be recalled or suppressed without catastrophic disruption. The boy realized he was no longer a single vessel of memory. He had become the architect of a system capable of bending outcomes without confrontation. Obedience faltered not because of defiance, but because the illusion of control was destabilized. And every small disruption, every awakened mind, sent a pulse through the structures of power, making the unseen visible, the unquestioned questionable, and the unchallenged vulnerable. He understood, with sharp clarity, that he had crossed a threshold. Memory had become influence, influence had become action, and action had become change. The boy, once enslaved, once hunted, had become a force that could shape reality without leaving a trace. And in that knowledge, he felt the thrill of inevitability. Systems built on fear cannot endure the awakened mind. And he was only beginning to awaken them. The masters began to notice the first subtle failures, though they refused to admit the truth. Something they could not see was unraveling their control. Decisions that had once been unquestionable were challenged. Orders were ignored, misinterpreted, or delayed. Loyalty, the very foundation of their power, began to fracture. And with each misstep, fear spread. Not the fear they wielded over others, but the fear that they themselves were losing control. Paranoia took root. Advisors whispered behind closed doors, questioning the motives of one another. Enforcers, trained to detect disobedience, began to suspect every movement, every glance, every hesitation as evidence of hidden defiance. The masters were no longer confident. They were calculating, doubting, and reacting to shadows. And all the while, the boy observed, cataloging each crack, each fracture, each subtle sign of destabilization. He had become the invisible lever bending the structures of power without ever confronting them directly. The boy's network continued to act with precision. Those awakened were not mere pawns, they were instruments of influence, carefully placed to sow doubt, redirect perception, and create ripples of uncertainty. A single hesitant word here, a carefully planted fragment of memory there, a question that seemed casual but carried deep implication, all combined to destabilize authority. The masters, confident in their own cleverness, could not trace the source, and with every failure, their fear grew, feeding the very system they relied upon to maintain order. He understood something crucial. The most powerful structures crumble not from force, but from doubt. The illusion of control is far more vulnerable than the reality of obedience. And once a single mind begins to question, once even a few sparks of awareness ignite, the machinery of fear unravels like a tapestry pulled at its seams. The boy had become the catalyst, the unseen disruptor, the ghost in the holes of power. And in that realization, he felt both exhilaration and caution. He was no longer just a memory keeper. He was an architect of subtle revolution, orchestrating fear and belief without being detected. Yet he knew the masters would respond eventually, with greater cunning, greater ruthlessness, and far more dangerous strategies. The stakes had escalated. The game was no longer survival, it was domination, subtle but absolute, fought entirely in the realm of mind, memory, and perception. The response came quietly but with lethal precision. The masters, realizing that subtle disruptions were spreading too far to ignore, deployed a counterstrike, not with armies, not with brute force, but with deception, surveillance, and manipulation designed to flush out the source. Advisors were replaced, informants planted, and trusted allies subtly tested. Every action was calculated to expose weakness, to detect patterns, to identify the invisible hand reshaping obedience and loyalty. The boy sensed the shift immediately. The air grew tense, shadows moved differently, conversations became traps, and every minor discrepancy felt magnified. He understood instinctively that the masters had adapted. They were no longer reacting blindly. They were anticipating, predicting, and probing for the ghost in the system. And yet, their attempts only revealed their own limitations. They could see patterns, but they could not perceive the architecture of his memory or the network of awakened minds acting in concert. He escalated in response. Every layer of misdirection was reinforced, every fragment of knowledge encoded with deeper subtleties, every interaction calibrated to protect the network while destabilizing the masters further. He began to anticipate not just their moves, but their reactions to his countermoves, creating a dynamic system of influence that operated faster and more subtly than they could trace. Fear became both shield and weapon, manipulated to guide decisions without revealing the true source. The boy also tested his network in unprecedented ways. Allies were given scenarios designed to simulate the master's probing, forcing them to act with precision under pressure, to think independently, and to manipulate perception without being detected. Each successful maneuver strengthened the web of influence. Each failure revealed vulnerabilities to be corrected. And through it all, the boy catalogued every reaction, every flaw, every miscalculation, not just of his adversaries, but of himself, refining his strategy with relentless discipline. By the end of the first counterstrike, the masters were unsettled. They had failed to locate the source of disruption, yet they had revealed their own fragility. Doubt, fear, and paranoia had intensified, spreading among them like a contagion. And the boy, watching from the shadows, understood the law that would guide the rest of his journey. The most powerful are most vulnerable to invisible influence, and memory, strategy, and subtle manipulation can bend even the seemingly untouchable if applied with patience, precision, and foresight. The first tangible evidence of his influence appeared in the corridors of power. A decree that had been set in stone for decades was quietly amended. A decision meant to crush dissent was postponed, reshaped by whispers, hesitation, and unseen nudges planted weeks before. The masters, confident in their control, assumed it was chance, error, or luck. But the boy knew differently. Every subtle misstep, every pause, every ripple of doubt had been orchestrated, and he catalogued it meticulously in his mind. He realized something profound. Influence at the top does not come from confrontation. It comes from shaping perception. A single idea, planted at the right moment, can redirect the course of an entire empire. And the boy, who had once been a slave, now moved unseen through these structures, bending decisions without revealing his presence. Each action was invisible, yet irreversible. The world changed around him, not by force, but by strategy, memory, and subtle manipulation of belief. The boy also noted the psychological effects on the masters. Confidence eroded, paranoia intensified, and their actions became reactive rather than deliberate. Every decision was now filtered through fear of the unseen. And in that fear, he found opportunity. By understanding their perception, he could anticipate moves, redirect intentions, and nudge outcomes with surgical precision. He had become the invisible hand shaping reality, the unseen architect of events that none suspected were being influenced. His network, too, grew in sophistication. Those he had awakened were no longer merely observers, they acted independently, carrying fragments of forbidden knowledge into places he could not reach personally. Their actions were small, subtle, yet cumulative, amplifying the invisible pressure on the masters. And every ripple fed back into the boy's mind, refining his calculations, strengthening his network, and expanding the reach of his influence without a single trace being detected. By the end of the cycle, the boy understood a terrifying truth. Once memory, strategy, and perception align, the world can be shifted without a single sword drawn, without a single command issued. Obedience fractures, fear becomes a tool, and influence can cascade through systems designed to be unassailable. And as he watched the first high-level decisions bend subtly to his invisible hand, he realized that he had crossed another threshold. He was no longer surviving history. He was shaping it. The first whispers of suspicion began to echo through the halls of power. The masters, once confident in their absolute control, sensed a disturbance they could neither see nor predict. Reports conflicted, obedience wavered, and patterns emerged that did not fit their understanding of loyalty or order. Panic, subtle but pervasive, began to take root. They had assumed their systems were unbreakable, yet a ghostly hand had begun bending reality to an invisible will. They intensified their surveillance, placing agents in hidden corners, scrutinizing correspondence, and testing the allegiances of those they believed loyal. Each step was designed to uncover the source of the disruption, to strike at the mind that threatened to unravel centuries of control. Yet for all their precision, their fear blinded them. They could detect anomalies, but not the pattern orchestrating them. And with every failed attempt to identify the source, doubt deepened, spreading like poison through their ranks. The boy observed this escalation with a mixture of caution and cold clarity. Every measure they took revealed their vulnerabilities, their assumptions, their reliance on obedience, their fear of the unseen. He adapted, refining his network, calibrating his influence, and manipulating perception to amplify confusion while keeping his hand invisible. Every agent sent their reactions fed into his strategy. Every misstep became an opportunity, and every ripple of fear was redirected to strengthen his position. He also realized another terrifying truth. Fear can be harnessed, but only if it is precise. Indiscriminate fear destroys control. Carefully applied fear magnifies influence. He began to experiment subtly, allowing the master's suspicion to grow in controlled ways, nudging decisions, and sowing uncertainty without exposing the full scope of his network. Doubt became his weapon, invisibility became his shield, and strategy became the very air his adversaries breathed. By the end of this cycle, the boy had achieved a delicate balance. The masters were more vigilant than ever, yet their attempts to regain control only tightened the grip of his influence. The invisible hand remained unseen, the awakened minds resilient, and the systems of power destabilized from within. And he understood with unshakable certainty, once perception is bent, once memory and strategy align, fear becomes the master of the masters themselves, and the world's most powerful men are revealed not as omnipotent, but as fragile, flawed, and manipulable. The boy had studied them long enough to see the fishes hidden beneath their pride. Every master, no matter how ruthless, had a weakness, an assumption, a fear, a blind spot that could be leveraged. And now, after years of observation, he identified a critical vulnerability: their reliance on trust within the very hierarchy they believed unbreakable. A single misaligned loyalty, a moment of doubt, could unravel the facade of control entirely. He acted with precision, using coded signals, carefully planted fragments of memory, and subtle manipulations of perception. He amplified existing cracks. Advisors were made to question one another. Alliances shifted imperceptibly. Whispers of uncertainty multiplied in every direction. By the time the masters realized something was amiss, the fault lines had widened beyond their control. Decisions were delayed, punishments misapplied, and authority, once absolute, began to falter under the weight of invisible influence. The boys' network, now highly disciplined and coordinated, executed their roles with precision. Each awakened mind acted like a cog in a vast, unseen machine, influencing perception, redirecting suspicion, and subtly destabilizing the hierarchy. And he observed it all from the shadows, cataloging outcomes, refining tactics, and pushing the invisible hand of influence further into the heart of the system. Every ripple, every hesitation, every moment of doubt magnified the effect of his actions. Yet he remained cautious. He understood the danger of overreach. Exposure could destroy everything in a single instant. And so, he balanced the acceleration of disruption with the protection of secrecy, carefully orchestrating outcomes so that fear, doubt, and uncertainty grew organically, leaving no trace of the architect behind them. He had become a master of anticipation, predicting reactions and controlling them before they fully formed, bending reality through perception and strategy alone. By the time the first high-level decisions began to collapse under pressure, the boy realized something extraordinary. The masters, who had built empires on obedience and fear, were unraveling themselves. And the force behind it, the memory, insight, and strategy of a boy once enslaved, remained invisible. Knowledge had become action, action had become influence, and influence had become power. The world itself was bending under the weight of the unseen, and he was the hand guiding it. The masters, sensing the collapse of control, decided to act openly for the first time. They could no longer rely solely on subtlety. The invisible influence had grown too strong, too pervasive. They convened in secrecy, devising strategies not just to restore obedience, but to flush out the architect behind the disruption. Every advisor, every enforcer, every agent was instructed to identify anomalies, interrogate the network, and root out the unseen threat. Their confidence was a veneer, fragile and cracking, yet their determination was lethal. The boy anticipated this escalation. He had catalogued their psychology for years, their fears, their assumptions, their patterns of overconfidence. He knew that direct confrontation would be as much about perception as action, and he prepared accordingly. Every move of his network was synchronized, every fragment of memory encoded to mislead, misdirect, and manipulate. He would not fight with force. He would fight with clarity, with anticipation, with the invisible architecture of influence that had been honed to perfection. The duel began quietly. The masters probed, questioned, and tested, each interaction a trap designed to expose the boy or his network. Every subtle response from his allies was a message, every hesitation a controlled signal. And the boy, observing from the shadows, orchestrated it like a chess master, predicting each move, calculating every outcome, and bending the agent's fear against themselves. Doubt became a weapon, perception became a battlefield, and silence became the medium through which power was exercised. It was a psychological duel of the highest order. The masters, blinded by arrogance and fear, could not perceive the invisible patterns guiding every hesitation, every misstep, every seemingly insignificant decision. They were reacting, not acting, and the boy, anchored by memory and strategy, moved through their uncertainty like water flowing through cracks in stone, inescapable, unseen, unstoppable. By the end of the confrontation, the masters were unsettled, disoriented, and increasingly paranoid. They had acted decisively, yet their moves only amplified the boy's influence. And he understood the immutable law that governed this struggle. Knowledge aligned with strategy can bend the most formidable systems without ever being seen. The world's most powerful men were playing a game they could not comprehend, and the boy, once enslaved, once hunted, was not just surviving the game. He was winning it.